Welcome to episode 319 of the Baunfire Gaming Podcast. I am your host, Morgan, aka Bon Diesel, and this week we'll be talking about Xbox's rumored 2026 hardware, Switch 2 hardware confirmed, a bunch of CES reveals, and much more. Before we get started, thank you to everyone who supports as YouTube members and Twitch subscribers. If you're interested in supporting the show and all of my other content, please check out the link in the show description. Subscribe to the Baunfire Gaming Podcast on your favorite podcast app, leave a review on Spotify or iTunes, and subscribe to the Bon Diesel YouTube channel to get all of my videos, including this podcast. Lastly, become part of the conversation by joining my Discord to chat with our little community, or by leaving comments on the YouTube video or the Spotify episodes. Gaming news, let's jump into the main story, which this week is rumors of a new Xbox hardware in 2026. This is kind of an interesting story. It comes from Twitter user The Ghost of Hope. This person is a relatively notable Call of Duty leaker, and they stated that a new Xbox console will come in 2026 with the next Call of Duty, which is presumed to be Modern Warfare 3, as a launch title. They claim that the console will be called Xbox Prime, but that seems like there's some debate whether or not that would just be a code name. Jez Corden of Windows Central, who's most often seen as one of the more reliable Xbox kind of insiders, has vaguely denied this rumor, but didn't really seem to explicitly completely deny it. The denial was interesting too. I talked about it in the video I made about this, in that someone quote tweeted the story from Insider Gaming and said something like, "Oh, this is too early in the generation to do this. This is like a slap in the face or whatever to current owners," which I think is a dumb point. I don't think, with the way that Xbox is doing their stuff now, they should be upgrading every 2 or 3 years, in my opinion. But we'll get to more of that another time. And Jez basically said none of this is true or something like that, or said that this isn't true. Jez has a habit of, he's rarely ever going to come out and just say exactly what he means about stuff. That's kind of when you have that insider status, which I've experienced in the tiniest way with some Ubisoft stuff. You never want to just come out and just blatantly say what you know, because there's a really good chance not too many people know what you know. And if you do that, you're going to put a target on the back of your sources or your source. So what Jez has done in the past, and you see this with other people as well, is he may only really be dismissing a part of this rumor, but it's easier to just do a blanket dismissal and then explain later. So when the truth actually comes out one day, he can say like, "Oh, well, I was denying the name, the Xbox Prime, but I wasn't necessarily denying." Like, I think specifically he said that there is no hardware called Xbox Prime coming out in 2026. So that can mean a lot of things. What's interesting about this is that, they're obviously, with this Call of Duty creator, they're talking about the possibility of it coming out with the next Call of Duty. There's or with the Call of Duty for that year. There's also something to keep in mind that this could come out along with that the haptic feedback Xbox controller that we've talked about recently. This could come out with the Unreal Engine 5 Halo game that we know, because 343 doesn't exist anymore. It's now Halo Studios, and that their first project, which I imagine they've been working on since Infinite came out, that would be a time frame I could see happening for that. But we also could see that Gears of War prequel, E-Day, come out late next year and be a release title for the next hardware as well. After seeing CES this week, we could also see this next bit of hardware take advantage of tech like the AMD's X3D CPU tech. I don't know how this works with the way that consoles are, because with consoles, you have to remember that you aren't just putting like an off-the-shelf chip and GPU into a console. They're taking that tech, they're taking similar tech, but putting onto proprietary boards that will fit into these consoles uniquely, right? So they're using tech that you can buy similar things of, like Digital Foundry has a, or is it Digital Foundry? Uh, it could be Gamers Nexus. I can't remember, but they made a home PC that is using an AMD CPU and an AMD GPU, which are as close as you can get to what the PS5 and the Xbox Series X has. Um, but it's not exactly the same. So I don't know if that X3D tech that AMD uses on a bunch of their CPUs now could even work in an SoC, or like a, a like what you would use in a console. But it'd be really cool if they could. And then we're also starting to see stuff about FSR 4.0, which I'll talk more about later. But that's been demoed at CES, labeled as a like experimental project, and it's already being talked about by people like Digital Foundry as being, maybe not as good as DLSS, but better than PSSR, which is currently kind of felt like the closest thing to DLSS. So it'd be really interesting if, we just found out about PlayStation and AMD working together, which I'm sure they're working with Xbox as well, but Xbox hasn't put out a press release about it yet. But it'd be interesting if this kind of internal war happens between AMD and PlayStation for this tech, because PlayStation's already said they're using AMD for the PS6. And it's kind of interesting that the PSSR is getting developed, I assume, alongside FSR4 or 5 or whatever the next stuff is going to be. Um, and there's always that possibility that PSSR is in its own way just a version of FSR as well. But I don't know enough about it to determine that. I think this is really interesting. I don't know if these rumors are even true about the next Xbox. I've been predicting for a while now that I do think 2026 would be a smart time for them to put out new hardware, because I think with all the concerns people have about their hardware now, them jumping the gun on PlayStation by a year or two, which I think that definitely would. I don't expect the PS6 until 2028, to be honest. I think if they jumped out ahead like that, it would maybe help them with sales, but more so, I think it would help them with kind of establishing what they're doing, to get out of that, like the rigmarole of always having, this generational fight with PlayStation, to just get out of that cycle, because they're not trying to directly compete with them anymore. Not in that way, especially not with hardware. Yeah, and especially if they're going to move forward with these ideas to release on more platforms, to have handhelds, to maybe even allow more than one hardware manufacturer to make Xboxes, or to make hardware that has the Xbox OS on it. The head of their hardware right now even was quoted this week. It was more talking about handhelds, but talking about trying to bring the best of Windows and Xbox together so that it's not such a disjointed system, and to put the focus on your library and letting you access your library anywhere you want, and to make Xbox hardware the best place to do that, but to not restrict it to that. And I think them doing this thing where they start to say like, hey, whether it's us or other manufacturers, we're going to be putting out new Xbox hardware that uses our OS, that uses our proprietary systems, every 2 or 3 years, instead of doing it every 6, 7, 8, 9 years. Because the whole goal is to let people kind of decide when they upgrade. And that also entails making your products backwards compatible to a reasonable amount. There will come a day, I think, when the Xbox Series X is the minimum system, and the Series S is no longer considered one of the supported systems. And then the X won't be anymore, and the next thing will be. And whether or not it's, an actual Xbox hardware, or it's, a PC, or it's a handheld, or it's other consoles, they'll kind of have that like rolling scale of what is meant to access the new stuff they're putting out. And that can especially work for Xbox, because they have focused so much on backwards compatibility and cloud and stuff, that there comes a time where your Xbox One, your Xbox One X, your Xbox One S, your Series S, your Series X, all can become essentially streaming machines. So say you have a Series S and that hardware becomes no longer supported, but they still give you the option to say, you can still play all the old games that were compatible with that system. For sure, you're good. And anything that's not, you can stream it. we're going to give you the option to still play that stuff. It's going to have some requirements. You're going to have the internet. You're going to have Game Pass, but you will still be able to play the brand new stuff. And if that's not the experience you want to play it hardware, then we'll offer you new hardware, or someone will offer you hardware that will allow you to do that as well. Like, to me, it turns into this thing where, especially if they support the idea of older hardware being able to stream brand new games to not cut people off, that they're going to have this rolling system where I think their ecosystem becomes even better, which I already think their ecosystem is excellent. Whether people agree or not, that's fine. But it just turns into this thing where I just think it becomes like a super consumer friendly situation, uh, and especially with backwards compatibility. As long as this hardware that's moving forward can still play stuff back to the Xbox original, which you currently can. It just becomes this really good ecosystem where, like, it's so funny how you see people freaking out about Xbox right now if they stop making hardware or whatever, because they all have this fear, and I'm one of these people, I guess, of like, well, if Xbox goes away, I have hundreds of thousands of games I'll lose access to. But if they keep doing their strategy the way they've been doing it, I think, and maybe I'm ignorant or biased or whatever, that they're only ensuring your future access to everything you ever had before. I can still load up saves I had from like the 360, because when I play those games, it loads up a virtual 360 and I'm able to play those old saves and stuff. Like, that's insane. And that's something you're not getting from other platforms. You've got Nintendo, who barely even knows the internet exists. You've got PlayStation, who is a hardware company through and through. And obviously that's not a knock on them. They're very good at what they do. But they obviously show some lacking in the software and the, kind of, the departments of like technology that aren't hardware. I mean, there's a reason that Sony uses Microsoft Azure services and servers. It's, they're different kinds of companies that are good at different things. So whether these rumors are true or not, I have no idea. We won't really know. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a grain of truth in that, and that I wouldn't be surprised at all if there's new hardware in 2026. And one thing I saw keep popping up, people being like, "Oh, this is just a mid-gen refresh," even though they said they don't have to do that. A mid-gen refresh is if they keep the same like generation of technology and just put better stuff in. So if the current Series X is the equivalent, I think it's like a 2700X CPU, and I don't know what GPU it's equivalent to, but like say it's like a 5600X or whatever. I don't know. I don't really know AMD GPUs very well. What PlayStation basically did was just put in like a 2800X, like a little bit. Actually, they didn't even do that. The CPU is still the same, but they basically like did like a slightly better GPU of the same generation, though it does have a little bit of new tech, but not very much. Where this next Xbox, the idea is that it would be like an AM5 processor, which is a whole new generation from the AM4 that the 3700, even 5700, or 50,000 series AMD CPUs were. It's more than likely the next, Xbox and PlayStation will be using, 7,000, 9,000, series AMD CPUs, and whatever, the 9,000 series, I guess, GPUs are, or maybe even beyond that. We'll see. And like, I don't think this is going to be a mid-gen refresh from Xbox. This would be a brand new console that's new generation hardware. I assume that presumption comes from people who like the other box, who are going to have to wait a couple years to get their version of that. But then what's going to happen is that, say the PS6 doesn't come out till 2028. Well, it's going to be significantly faster than whatever Xbox puts out in 2026. But then Xbox will probably put out something new in 2029 or 2030. And then, by then we'll see who's even making hardware anyways. So it's an interesting story. I don't put too much faith into it, but I do think it's an interesting thing to talk about. As for some other stories, we have even more Nintendo Switch leaking stuff. It's kind of funny at this point. Nintendo might as well just reveal their hardware, or unless maybe this is great advertisement for them. But we, almost every day are getting some kind of leak of hardware. I will say that some of this story is based on a accessory manufacturer who told everyone that this case they were making is definitely going to fit the new Switch, which they had like models of on the CES the floor. And they've since refuted that. So take that with a grain of salt. But the most interesting part is that we've gotten pictures and what seem almost certainly true pictures of like the actual, like, graphics boards and the SoC and everything inside the new Switch. And one of the interesting things, comes from Digital Foundry, is that it's using a 5 nanometer chip, which, current, like the newest chips out there are like 2 or 3 nanometer. And what's interesting about that is that suggests that the CPU GPU tech in this isn't very new, and it could be actually kind of old. I believe that there's a thought that the CPU GPU solution used in the Switch 2 could be something that was announced as far as like 5 or 6, 7 years ago. Now it's only been more recently manufactured, but it's old tech. And that wouldn't be that crazy. There's been rumors for a while that I've talked about for years now that they may have set the hardware spec for the Switch 2 like 3 or 4 years ago. And they may have been stockpiling these things and manufacturing them for years at this point, and they've even said that they intend on, when they release this, to not have shortages, that they have so many made before that they won't sell out. Now we'll see if that actually happens or not. But more than anything, Nintendo doesn't want scalpers making money that they could be making. So I wouldn't say this is completely generous from them, but it's still a good thing. There's also some curiosity into what versions of DLSS this is going to make. So keep in mind that this CPU GPU solution they're using for the next Switch isn't AMD and it's not Intel. It's NVIDIA completely. We know NVIDIA as a CPU, as a GPU manufacturer, but they also have the ability to have CPU products. They don't use the same architecture as Intel and AMD, but they use an architecture that works with the Switch, right? And so what's interesting about it is that there's I don't want to call it concern, but there's thoughts that because this older CPU GPU solution may only be able to have access up to DLSS 2.0. And a big pusher of the next Switch from people has been, oh, well, it's going to have DLSS in it because they're using NVIDIA. So it's going to be able to, even if it can only run like 720p on a lot of their games, at whatever FPS, they'll be able to use DLSS to boost that to 1080 or whatever on your TV through the dock, and to higher frame rates, 60, 120, whatever, using DLSS. The problem is if it's only using DLSS 2.0, it'll be okay, but it's not going to be that great. And it's definitely not going to be, it's going to work really well on games that are already a few years old, but it may not be as useful on newer games. And the whole idea of a new system of DLSS was people seem to be hoping that there was going to be more third-party access to video games on Nintendo on their new console, where the Switch could barely play any games on its hardware that weren't Nintendo, even though it could barely play a lot of Nintendo games as well. And so it used the streaming solution to do a lot of more demanding games. Obviously, that's not an ideal situation, especially from Nintendo, which has a fairly spotty record when it comes to the quality of their, online systems in general, but especially their streaming. So it's interesting. In the Digital Foundry video about this, they even talked about how, all of the conversation lately has been like, oh, this new Switch is going to be around the power of like a PS4 Pro or an Xbox One X. It won't be quite the current gen, but it'll be pretty competitive. Therefore, it will be able to play a lot of games that are even fairly modern, especially using DLSS. Well, now the concern with this SoC, with some of the tech they've seen, is that it may not even be as powerful as the last gen, like OG consoles. This argument keeps coming up. It comes up all the time. And I agree to a point that, we just, at this point, we are not expecting Nintendo to put out hardware that's going to truly compete with PlayStation and Xbox and PC. Like, those platforms and those users are obviously looking for a different experience than what the average Nintendo person is looking for, especially at the price. Because the Switch 2 is probably going to be like $300 or $400. It's going to be cheaper than even any of the current consoles, more than likely. And so I appreciate that, their target audience isn't expecting 4K 120 FPS. My concern is that it seems like there's a really good chance they're going to be in the same situation they're already in. and likely struggling to have games that even run at 60 FPS, that even run at 1080p. And and maybe Nintendo's fine with that. They've obviously been rewarded for that, not having that concern with the Switch. And if they don't address that with the Switch too, like most people, the majority of their 100 million plus users, consumers, I guess probably won't care. But I think that sucks. I think it sucks because Nintendo could provide a better product if they wanted to. They're one of the richest platforms. They make a hilarious profit margin on their products. And, they could make games that don't look like, multi-generation old games. They could make games that run well. They could make hardware that can help those games run well and look better. Even if they don't look like top of the line anything, they could still do well. But instead, it seems like they've kind of taken a similar attitude as many of their consumers of just being like, yeah, no, but they got Pokemon and Zelda, so no one cares. Like, that sucks. Like, they could care, and I think it's weird that they don't. So, we'll see. I'm still interested in one of these. I will say I'm getting less and less excited about it. I haven't owned a Nintendo piece of hardware since my Game Boy Color back in the day. So I have like 20 plus years of games to catch up on. So even a mediocre Switch 2 is going to be better than anything I've played in 20 years. So I guess I'm not that worried about it. And I think the average Nintendo gamer isn't going to be that concerned about it either. But I think it's one of those things that, like, I understand they don't have to do better to compete hardware wise, but they could. Like, and no one should have to force them to. Like, they could just put out a good product instead of a good enough product. And I feel like that's what's going to happen, but I'll be happily proven wrong. At CES, NVIDIA has revealed their 5000 series of GPUs, specifically the 5090, 5080, 5070 Ti, and the 5070. The 5060 so far hasn't been talked about, but it's almost certain that in the next few months they will reveal probably a 5060 and a 5060 Ti. It was an interesting presentation, and it was not a big part of it. NVIDIA is very much an AI company at this point. They are one of the biggest, or at least on paper, one of the biggest companies in the world. It's mostly driven by an insane amount of sales they're making on AI based hardware that does AI generation and all of that. That isn't customer. Like, we don't buy those things. These graphics cards that we buy can do that stuff, kind of. But like, you have to keep in mind, like, NVIDIA's base business is making servers and GPUs that are only for businesses and that we never see. And they sell like crates of them, like millions of them, to these companies. At this point, their GPU business is kind of just like PR for them to a point. I'm sure they still make money on it, but it's not what they're in the business for anymore. And so what was interesting is that he like put out the point that like the 5070, the lowest tier product that they have revealed, $550, price for the founders edition that they make, can run games as well as the 4090, which is a $1,500 card, with some caveats, right? Obviously, if you're not using any of their tech, their AI tech, on a card versus card basis, the 4090 is going to just destroy the 5070. But the idea is that if they're both using DLSS and using their frame generation tech, that the 5070 can put out performance similar to the 4090. And that's maybe true. There are some things that the 5000 series can use that the 4000 can't, that may help it on paper in very generous charts, make that comparison seem valid. That said, you have the $2,000 5090, which is, wild. And it's just going to be straight up a pure card that can just do insane amounts of work without DLSS and all that. I'm sure it will utilize that tech, but it doesn't have to. But you're also paying for it, right? So I found this to be kind of exciting. I've had a dream for a long time that Xbox would like buck the trend and use NVIDIA for their GPU solution. And I just really doubt we would ever see a collaboration between AMD and NVIDIA in this situation. So then you'd be looking at Xbox having to use like a NVIDIA CPU, which they aren't ready for. They don't make the right tech for that yet. or heaven forbid, have to use an Intel CPU to go along with NVIDIA tech, and that probably wouldn't be worth it. So we'll see. We'll see what happens with that. And NVIDIA probably really doesn't give a crap whether or not Sony or Xbox wants to work with them. So, it's even their Nintendo collaboration is probably somewhat generous of them, but we'll have to see what comes of that. So we're going to see more and more about these 5000 series GPUs. One thing that's really cool is that at least the founder editions are like half the size of recent cards that have been coming out. Now we've been seeing some third-party cards coming out that are even bigger than the 4000 series, but it seems like there is a way to make these 5000 series GPUs way smaller than they've been for a while. And that would be pretty cool, because even I have a 4070 Ti, and even it's a complete monster, and it's not even one of the like super duper powerful ones. So we'll see. We did get a Xbox Developer Direct announced. It's going to be on the 23rd of January at 1 p.m. Eastern time. Put that out to wherever you are. We know they're going to be talking about Doom, The Dark Ages, South of Midnight, and Clair Obscur Expedition 33. All three games I'm really curious about. Doom a little less so. I kind of don't care about the newer Doom games. It's just I'm not good at them, so I don't really care as much about them. South of Midnight I'm super interested in. And then Clair Obscur Expedition 33 looks like one of the coolest games I've seen. Like, I don't really love turn-based games with combat, but it looks like it's kind of like an action turn-based. And the aesthetic and the story that they've talked about so far, the voice acting cast that they've announced so far is wild. It's so good. And I'm super excited about that. And then what is kind of the most interesting thing about this Developer Direct is that they have at least one game from a developer, but a game that's new, that hasn't been announced yet, or at least talked about yet. And I've even predicted that it could be multiple games. There's no rules with these directs from them. They could talk about whatever they want. So just because they have one question mark spot on their graphic doesn't mean it's just one game. We've had people like Jez Corden come out and say that this may be a bigger deal than people think. And the people are intrigued, I think. These developer directs have been really good. They've done them the last, I think this is the third one. And what's so good about them is that they're obviously previews of these games, and they're previews of games that are coming to Xbox. Notably, Doom: The Dark Ages is going to be day and date on PlayStation. So, maybe not just Xbox, but it's nice of Xbox to give PlayStation some new games. It seems like they're struggling there a little bit. But what I like about these developer directs is that they typically do like deep dives on the studios and the people actually working on the games, and give them a chance to talk about the thing that they're doing. And maybe it's all PR fluff. That's fine if that's what it is, or that's what you think it is. But I still do think it's cool, and it's exciting for me to hear people talk about the games that they're making, because you can just always see the pride and the love that these people have for what they're doing. So, yes, I'm really excited about this. I'll be streaming. I'll be co-streaming it, doing all that stuff. So check out my Twitch if you and follow me there. It's just twitch.tv/BondDiesel if you want to hang out while we watch that. At CES, AMD has kind of lightly revealed new CPUs and GPUs. They went in pretty hard on the CPUs, even though, like they look cool. Like they have like a 9950 X3D that's going to be like $600 or more, and is going to be just the best CPU for gaming for years. But they also had some lower stuff that was cool. But the interesting thing is they've revealed they're changing up their naming scheme with their GPUs. Definitely just trying to one up NVIDIA. But they released info kind of about their 9070 and like 9070X and 9070 XTX or something GPUs, which is using a bunch of new tech, which we're probably going to be seeing in the next gen consoles. But then they like pulled back a bunch on info about it after the NVIDIA reveal. And we're still kind of trying to figure out whether or not it was because they felt like they were getting overshadowed, or because they felt like they had an opportunity to kind of overshadow if they saved their day for another time. It's worth remembering that AMD is pretty much pulling out of the super high-end GPU game. They've said it themselves. So like the 5090, AMD will probably not put out a card that's equivalent to the 5090. They're not going to put out a $2,000 GPU. They're more going to be targeting that 5060, 5070, maybe 5080, NVIDIA lineup with their stuff. And from what, some of the rumors I've seen so far about the 9070 and some of the other cards that they've shown is that it's around the 4070 or 5070 performance, which would be pretty good, especially if, so say like the 5070 Ti, it's $750. If AMD can put out a similar speed, if not slightly faster product for $100 less, that's going to be good for them. As cool as it is to have a 5090 or 4090, that's only literally probably a few hundred, maybe a few thousand people in the world who are going to buy those. But you're talking about millions of people buying 5060s, 5070s, 5070 Ti's, and 5080s because the price point is literally half or less or a fourth. So AMD targeting that makes more sense, and I'm curious to see what they do with that. One thing that was cool, and Digital Foundry talked about it, is that when they were at the AMD booth seeing things, they had, and I mentioned this before, they had a comparison of FSR3 and a experimental project, which they're presuming is FSR4, and it was showing all the issues that they have with FSR3. It has lots of ghosting problems, lots of issues with the backgrounds of images and stuff like that. And FSR4, or this new project, having none of those problems and running extremely well. This is where they started to say, like, if that's FSR4 and that holds up, it's better than PSSR, or at least the current state of PSSR. Something to keep in mind about PSSR is the PlayStation 5 Pro is, I would argue, basically a beta test for the PS6, especially with PSSR. They're collecting user data. They're collecting, everything that's happening on the PS5 Pro is going to improve the PS6. So maybe the current PSSR can't compete with FSR4 or whatever they're going to be showing, but that's more likely going to be closer in the future because the PS5 Pro has a point. There's reason it exists, and it's not purely just to give a mid-gen refresh. It's to basically make their future tech better. The last couple stories here, Jennifer Hale of Mass Effect fame as the F-Shep voice, female Shepard, says that most of the trilogy cast of the game would love to be part of the live action TV series that's being made by Amazon. This is kind of interesting because Brandon Keener isn't a Turian. He can't play one in a live action game. Though, presuming those characters are going to be CGI, they possibly could if those characters are in the show. But someone like Jennifer Hale, for better or worse, they probably aren't going to cast her as FemShep if it's going to be focused on FemShep. And what's hard for me is that like Mark Meer or Jennifer Hale and these other people should be the voices of their characters, right? And what I am bummed about that this is a live action show that Amazon is doing is that it's just going to be so hard to pull off. And maybe they can. They've done a bunch of really good shows about video games. And, if anyone can do it, they can. I trust them more than Netflix and a bunch of the others. But Mass Effect, especially if you're going to be doing a story set during the trilogy that involves those trilogy characters, it just makes so much more sense to do like an animated style, like the Cyberpunk animated show, or even the League of Legends one, or like I've even pointed out there's a Mass Effect YouTube channel, like the official BioWare channel, and they have the soundtrack of Mass Effect from the Legendary Edition set to these like 4 or 5 different like kind of animated scenes from the game with showing the characters from the game. And the art style they use for that would be absolutely perfect for a show. And you could have all the original voice actors and you could do things, and it doesn't have to, it'd probably be a lot cheaper than doing all the CGI they're going to have to do with a live action show. And it would almost certainly look better. So I hope that the trilogy cast gets to be involved, even if it's not as their characters. I really would love to see them get a chance to be a part of that project. And then that kind of rolls into the next game, which I'm expecting that we'll start hearing stuff about probably sooner than later. I've kind of given up hope that they're going to be in the next game. I don't think Tally and, a lot of these characters that we even Shepard is going to be in the next game, or at least not directly. But I would still love to see them all be able to be involved, even if it's not as their characters. There's also going to be a lot of opportunities to have like memorials on various planets, or it's almost certain to me that we're going to play the next game, we're going to go to the Citadel, and there's going to be a part of the Citadel that's like a monument to the Reaper War, and it's going to have recordings of Shepard or even the crewmates and things like that, and the things that they did, that we did in the games. And they're going to have like the memorial version of that. And I think it'd be kind of cool to see, like, I'll say this game takes place hundreds of years later. How are they retelling that story in these memorials? Even though we know what really happened, at least our own reality of it. But in those ways, they could give us an opportunity, or give that original cast an opportunity to be part of the project. But one way or the other, I hope that we get to see everyone stay involved. Then the final thing here, rumors dropped actually today, here on Friday, that Microsoft Flight Simulator and the Halo Master Chief Collection could be coming to PlayStation and the Switch 2 this year. And that as well, we may be seeing the Final Fantasy VII Remake coming to Xbox and Switch in 2025, and then Rebirth coming in 2026. None of this is surprising. One of these things is going to get sensationalized and turned into a big, tantrum by a bunch of people about, Halo Remastered, the Halo Master Chief Collection and Microsoft Flight Simulator going to other platforms. Like, those things aren't selling Xboxes right now. Like, anything that isn't going to be selling Xboxes is going to be probably everywhere sooner and later. Same as, you're just not going to see the same argument the other way back, though. And, Final Fantasy VII, those remakes coming to the other platforms makes sense, because Square Enix has been pretty forward about saying, like, hey, like, we can't do this exclusive thing anymore. It doesn't make sense to us anymore. As well as the idea that, this sounds like this may be a more common occurrence, especially with Switch. I think that there's plenty of PlayStation games, at least third-party developed games, that would come to Xbox, if not simply because PlayStation doesn't want to be seen the same as Xbox is right now. But I still think in the long run, it's just going to be the way things are, that you're going to see a handful of games stay truly exclusive. But especially on the Xbox side, I think that's going to be pretty minimal. And at the end of the day, they want to sell software because that's what makes money. And they aren't going to force people onto their hardware because that doesn't make money. There are some things in there, like when it comes to, how much profit margin you get and things like that, that obviously there's a reason PlayStation is being stubborn about this, and Nintendo to a point. But I think these things are going to be more and more normal. And I hope that sooner than later, the people who report on all this stuff will finally accept that. Finally, with some content updates, I've been crazy sick the last few weeks. You can probably still tell. I've tried to minimize too many, stuffed noses and stuff during the show, but if I left any in, I'm sorry. I'll try to cut them out. I am feeling better, even though it may not sound like it. I am getting back to it with videos. I'm getting back to it with streams and podcasts, and trying to stay up with that. Like right now, I have a Mass Effect video set for this coming Tuesday. So if you're a member of my YouTube, you can watch it right now. If not, you can check it out on Tuesday or anytime after that, where I'm talking about how, like, Mass Effect is BioWare's next game and how cool that is, how excited I am about it. But go check that out if you want, or wait till Tuesday and you can see it then. And that is where I'm going to wrap things up here. If you have your own topics, questions, or feedback, be sure to let me know in my Discord, in the YouTube comments, or hit me up on my socials at Baundiesel or at the Baunfire. That is all I have for this episode of the Baunfire Gaming Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time.